Vikings talk. It's Purple Daily on Score North and ScoreNorth.com.
Purple Daily on Draft every Monday right here on the Purple Daily YouTube channel, where we just want to see the Vikings win a Super Bowl before we die. Of course, Purple Daily on Draft is the NFL draft perspective, kind of encapsulated across the full year. Tyler Forness, Miles Gorham, Declan Goff here to take you through an NFL draft perspective as it relates to the Vikings. We've taken that model and morphed it into the whole season. Now the Vikings are 0-2, so a lot and plenty to get into on today's episode on Purple Daily on Draft. And yeah, kind of a desperate time now for the Vikings, fellas. They've fallen to 0-2. We're also recording this on a late Sunday evening. The Chargers are 0-2, so we'll have a couple desperate teams going at it next Sunday. Vikings will be looking for their first win. But let's start here, because I think the biggest weakness so far for the Vikings has been interior defensive line. Teams just running up and down. I mean, Forno, you're the college expert, but at the same time, it doesn't even take a college football expert, an NFL expert. You watch how the Eagles ran down the Vikings' throat. I mean, it was basically like a college offense just marching down an NFL team pretty much. And the Vikings had no answer, whether it was Jalen Hurts, whether it was option plays. It doesn't matter who was in the backfield for the Eagles. They had a tough time stopping it. So I guess let's start here. Have the Vikings neglected their defensive line? And preferably, I guess specifically in the NFL draft, is that an area where you should try to sew that up early in drafts, Forno? Or are you looking to get interior defensive line help later in drafts? Have they missed the boat on fixing what used to be a very stout position for them for like basically 20 years up until a few years ago?
So this is a multi-layered question. So let's kind of start here. My personal belief is Brian Flores saw what they could do in the passing game and is like, no, beat me with a million paper cuts. And you're going to have to run against me. I'm not letting you throw. And they were able to get 2 deep bombs. Otherwise, it was 21 attempts and like 77 yards. Not exactly MVP caliber numbers from Jalen Hurts, who had a tremendous season last year. So his philosophy was, I'm not letting you beat me in the passing game. Beat me with the running game. And that's kind of how he played. Yeah, he had like the penny look where he had 5 on the line and 1 linebacker. Look, it didn't work. And Ivan Pace got exposed a little bit. Still a very good player, tremendous for a UDFA, but he got exposed in the running game. The defensive line just wasn't good enough. I don't know why Jaquelin Roy was a healthy scratch. I don't know why Kyrus Tonga wasn't playing more, because Harrison Phillips is not a 2-gap nose tackle. He just isn't. He can play in a 4-3-1 gap like Linval Joseph did, or he can play like a 4-I-5 technique. He can't be a 2-gapper where you're asking him to cover both A gaps in the running game. That's just not his game. And asking him to do so is honestly, to a point, setting him up to fail. So we got that under control. Now, not everybody's going to be able to do what the Eagles did, because the Eagles have a tremendous offensive line. DeAndre Swift has a lot of talent, hasn't really been able to put it together for a multitude of reasons. One, Detroit Lions offensive line was booty for the first couple years of his career, and he kept getting hurt. So now he's in a much better situation theoretically, and it showed on Thursday night. But they have neglected it to a point, because in a 3-4, your defensive line, you need good players, and the Vikings have good players. Problem is, when they have stinkers, it shows up a lot more than when you have great players who don't have a good game. And this needs to be addressed moving forward. But theoretically, as they continue this competitive rebuild, my look on it is this was one area they decided to hold off on because they wanted to upgrade what they deemed more premium positions. And I think pass rushing defensive tackle is becoming a premium position. Look at how some of these guys are getting paid around the league. Quinnen Williams, Aaron Donald, Christian Wilkins is about to get a big payday because of the contributions that they're giving on the field. Look at Chris Jones. Like, he's asking for like $30 million. And quite frankly, he's worth it based on his performance. So it's multifaceted. And when you're talking about the NFL draft, if they're great, take them early. If they have high upside, but they just haven't pieced it together, take dart throws on big guys with high upside athleticism and see if you can work with it. See if you can develop it. You see all the time defensive linemen who are late round picks end up panning out, because sometimes it just takes a little bit of NFL coaching and NFL weight room, that kind of structure, to really get the most out of some of these high upside athletes. So if you see the elite guy, take him. Otherwise, dart throw after dart throw after dart throw until you figure it out. And the Vikings may have to spend a bunch of money on the position so they can figure it out quicker.
And they've certainly done that in the past before, right? Like look at Big Pat Williams over 20 years ago. I mean, Linval Joseph, same thing. I mean, they have spent significant money at a position that isn't the sexiest position, but to Forno's point, it's becoming almost integral now to be taken seriously as a contender in the NFL. The Vikings have neglected it, and now for 3 years, they've had probably one of the worst, if not the worst, run defenses in the league. Miles, you were a former college football guy. You played a little college football, played some high school football too. Is there any type of thing that can salvage this internally? Are you looking to maybe add something, whether that's a trade or a waiver wire? Take us through your former college football career and see if maybe there's something we can add to this Vikings interior defensive line.
I don't know, being a former receiver really helps in this case, but I think the tough part is it's in the middle of the season. Like, they were fortunate to get someone like Kairos Tonga last year on waivers or off the street essentially, but I don't think he's like a guy that you're going to be able to come in and revamp an entire defensive structure. You're not going to be able to do that with a guy off the street essentially. Maybe someone like a big bodied guy that you could bring in late, hits free agency or something like that. Maybe a low level trade, like you said, is possible, but they're at a point where they're not really going to be able to completely fix the issue now. They need kind of like two positions on that defensive line. Like, I think Harrison Phillips is a good player. He's like what Forno said is he's good at stopping the run. They don't have any pass rushers, but they also don't really have a big two gapper like Forno mentioned. So they don't have a guy like, if you want to run that, some people call it a NASCAR package. Some people call it like essentially the package they ran to stop Jalen Hurts on Thursday was, we need to go light. You have one guy in the middle and then go light everywhere else because we need to have that speed on the field to keep up with Hurts, Swift, AJ Brown, and Devontae Smith, like those types of weapons that they had. And so that was their game plan, is we're not letting those guys beat us through the air and with their speed. But the one thing that they don't have is that guy in the middle that can truly control the line of scrimmage, so that when a team like the Eagles wants to run it down your throat, when you decide to go light, you at least have some backup there, someone that can help contain a little bit more in the middle. And they didn't have that in Harrison Phillips or anybody for that matter. So that's the tough part the Vikings are really running with, because we know Flores wants to be a positionless type of defense where he wants guys to be able to move all over the place and play different roles. But it's really hard to do that when there's a few foundational pieces that you're missing in these areas. And that's one of them. And then obviously I think they still need another interior pass rusher. Now the ideal scenario is you find a guy that can kind of do a little bit of both, like a Christian Wilkins, like a how am I blanking on the Giants guy? Dexter Lawrence. Yeah, big sexy Dexter Lawrence, right? Like that type of guy. Like, I know those are like top 10 type of picks in the draft, but they really need a guy that can be a control the defensive line, control the line of scrimmage, but also threaten that pass rush as well. And they just really don't have anybody to do that, so they have to get creative with it. But as we saw on Thursday, when they try to get too creative, it can a team like the Eagles will say, well, we'll just change our game plan. Instead of using Jalen Hurts to outrun everybody, we'll just beat you down, beat it down your throats. And that's exactly what they did.
Obviously, we'll get into a little bit of quarterback discussion too, as it relates to the draft. But do you guys feel, at least as a whole, that the whole defensive line group is probably a humongous question mark and probably something that has to be addressed early in the draft next year, just because you have Daniil, who's basically could be walking in free agency. You don't know what you're going to get from Marcus Davenport, who's played like one snap in 2 games. And you have interior defensive linemen that are just basically replacement, if not worse level players. Mm-hmm. It feels like, to me at least, Forno, that the position group of the defensive line, there is a lot of questions, and you might have to address it immediately in the draft, starting in 2024.
I think that's a likely scenario, but we'll see what ends up happening with the quarterback position, because that's the biggest question mark. If we go on the assumption that the Vikings are moving on from Kirk Cousins, which it feels like they're going to, then how early are they going to take that guy? How much draft capital are they going to have Are they going to have to give up that second round pick or more to be able to move up to go get that guy? So there's a lot of variables here. Plus, I also want to mention, because it's a 3-4, I want to separate defensive line from edge rushers because they're treated differently
100%.
here. Unlike with what we've known in the Mike Zimmer defense, the 4-3, they're all on the line. But your defensive line and your edge rushers are kind of classified differently here. So I would prioritize paying one group and drafting the other. So I'd probably pay Danielle Hunter, Marcus Davenport, kind of figure that out, and then draft on the interior, because you're not going to be able to pay big bucks for both.
Right.
And you can kind of scheme a little bit around some of the nuances of the defensive line. It's a little bit harder to scheme around your edge rushers unless you're bringing a lot of pressure. And we've seen the impact Danielle Hunter's had. I can have really good linebackers, which that's a weak position group in itself. Jordan Hicks is 31 years old. Ivan Pace is very good, but he's limited, and he's not a do-it-all guy yet, and he may never be. So that box, everybody talks about defenders in the box. That's got to be a big priority, but I just don't know how that's going to end up looking, considering all the other variables the Vikings are going to have to deal with. But it's got to be in the top 3 or 4 positions that you're looking at.
Yeah, and it also, so real quick, it also needs to be, like you said, Forno, a priority. But and I'm going to say this as it, I know it's not easy, but it tends to be an easier way to find a big body interior guy than it does an edge rusher. It's harder to find those guys. You talk about just going and spend that money, but it's a lot easier to find a guy who can just plug the A gap and the B gap, the interior of the line, than a Danielle Hunter type of defensive lineman or edge rusher. So I think DeForno's point is they need to pinpoint, but they also need to spend. They need to spend money there. It doesn't need to be a lot. Kind of like offensive line, you can't just rely on mid-round picks all the time. You can't just rely. You kind of have to put a true investment in there if you really want to get an output back. And I think the interior defensive line is one of those situations where you probably need to go get at least one guy that's a foundational piece, and then you can kind of build around the rest of that guy with maybe lesser talent, because that guy kind of helps supersedes everything else. So that's the one thing I struggle with is how do you best find that combination? And I feel like they've struggled with that the last few years.
I think there's 2 areas that the Vikings can do here in the draft now. One of them is potentially them figuring out this team, and they're drafting somewhere in the teens, and they can maybe take a defensive lineman to what your guys are saying, or defensive or an edge rusher, whatever it is, and they can potentially fix that. But let's say here the Vikings, who are 0-2, continue to tailspin. I mean, there's a realistic path where this team could be 1-5, 1-6. As we get closer and closer to the trade deadline. We're not going to have a trade deadline conversation necessarily right away, but it definitely feels like, for the first time, especially with life after Kirk Cousins, that the idea of drafting a quarterback, which I feel like it always gets thrown around during the offseason, is now becoming more of a reality here as we get closer and closer with 0-2 starts and overreactions and all that fun stuff. And it's fun conversation to have, I guess, 4-2. But do you feel like if the Vikings are indeed tanking here, if they get off to this slow start, is this quarterback conversation a legitimate thing? Is it more of a plausibility at this point, if the Vikings are indeed 1-5, that a quarterback is probably significantly on their radar with their first pick in the draft next year?
I think it's significantly on their radar right now. I don't think anything changes with the quarterback discussion until we know the future of Kirk Cousins. If Kirk Cousins re-signs in 10 minutes, then you stop having the quarterback discussion in round 1, depending on what the contract is. If it's a 1-year deal, if you love the guy, you take him anyways. He sits for a year behind Kirk, then he takes over. But until we know that he's coming back or he's going somewhere else, the discussion's always going to be there. And it's that variable and uncertainty where you have to at least start preparing like he's not coming back. And this is just a commonplace thing for general managers. You believe a guy's not coming back, you're trying to replace him, even while he's still there. You're already starting that process. The Vikings did it with Adam Thielen. They believed he probably wasn't going to be back after the 2022 season. They scouted wide receivers. They took Jordan Addison, and it feels like it's working out pretty well. It's just a commonplace. It's not an anti-Kirk thing. It's just how you build a team. You have to always prepare for somebody leaving. And even if they have this really, really bad start, I don't think this Vikings team is truly going to tank until they're completely eliminated from the playoffs. And then I believe that they should start Jaren Hall and just see what he's got. Like,
sure.
And as long as the Vikings are in playoff contention and Kirk's healthy, you play Kirk Cousins, and there's no questions. But it's a very interesting conversation. And until Kirk actually signs a new deal, quarterbacks in play 100%. And I just think that we have to understand that that's where we're at. And there's really nothing we can do until we get more answers.
People don't want to admit there's going to be life after Kirk, but there's going to be a life after Kirk because he's 35 years old. And like, whether he signs an extension or not, like, they're making plans for life after Kirk because they have to. Like, I know all these talks about Justin Jefferson and his contract and tying to Kirk Cousins, but Justin Jefferson knows that 35-year-old Kirk will not be his quarterback his entire career. He's 24. Like, so I'm with you. I think it's very much one of those scenarios where it can be, they can go hand in hand. Like, in the ideal scenario, Kirk Cousins is here while you draft somebody behind him and that guy develops behind him. That's the perfect ideal world for the organization. Now, if you're Kirk Cousins, that's probably not the ideal world for you. You want to continue to always be that guy and not have that threat behind you. But, you know, we know how things work.
What makes this really intriguing, Miles, is the fact that in our formative years of football, we've barely had any continuity at the quarterback position.
Right.
Like, my earliest formative years were the 3 years of Warren Moon. And then Warren Moon gets hurt in 96. And then Brad Johnson takes over. Brad Johnson gets hurt in 98. And it's Randall Cunningham. Randall Cunningham stinks in 99. Jeff George. Dante Culpepper until 2005. Hey, Brad Johnson's back. Like, we've had such an continuity when we look at the team from Wisconsin, and they have essentially two quarterbacks for the total of 30 years. And we want that for ourselves because that's a great position to be in. And I think people have attached themselves a little bit to Kirk Cousins in that way because we crave that continuity. We want it. And he's played well. And there's no arguing that. But at 35 years old, it may be time, especially with how they're trying to reformat this team. So it's tough. Sometimes it's not always about how good the guy is. It's about moving forward. And those are difficult conversations.
Last thing on this for you guys before we transition to other topics, but do you think there is a path where the Vikings draft a rookie quarterback and Justin Jefferson still stays? And I guess I'll put the caveat as in he's not extended when the draft rolls around, right? So he's still under the 5th-year option. There hasn't been a contract extension worked out. But the first order of operation was they draft a quarterback. Miles, do you still see a path where JJ does still ink that long-term deal before 2024 starts?
Yeah, I think that's the priority for the Vikings. Like, and I think they're not letting JJ dictate like who the next quarterback's going to be, but they're definitely in his ear telling him what they're thinking. At least it feels that way. At least with what Quasi said in the offseason and those things, it definitely feels like they want him to be involved to understand what their process and thought is. So it's not just a blindside to him. So he knows the direction of the team. Because if he really is worried about what that like future is with a quarterback, you want that pen to paper for the Vikings. But, you know, if you're not going to give him that upfront honesty and information, then that's probably like a severed relationship. You want that a tight-knit relationship so that JJ does understand, you know, where you're trying to go, whether that is bring Kirk Cousins back, whether it's to just focus on the draft, what have you. So, yes, I think the full court press will be on to get JJ signed before the 2024 season starts.
We'll also have some Drake Maye conversation later on in this episode. He played the Golden Gophers over the weekend, and I want Forno's analysis from that after I've seen some stuff on tape. I was able to watch the majority of the game as well. But transitioning to at least a recent draft pick who looks like an absolute stud, probably the brightest, I guess, silver lining, shining light so far throughout this Vikings 0-2 start is Jordan Addison, who's caught a couple touchdowns here. He stretched the field, and Forno, I brought this up to you on Purple Access over the weekend, that it seems kind of reminiscent of the whole BC Johnson JJ situation from 3 years ago, where BC was a hard worker, Justin Jefferson's a first-round pick, and then all of a sudden it took until week 3 or so for JJ to get more of the reps. Are you there where you want to see against the Chargers and going forward that Jordan Addison should be getting even more reps than KJ Osborn for the rest of the season?
I think so. The only real difficulty I have in that is how respected KJ is in the building and how hard of a worker he is and the effort that he's put into making himself a receiver when he was drafted as a kick returner. And I know I've said this on this show before. I've said it on Purple Access, but when you're drafted as only a returner and not even given the, for lack of a better term, dignity of being drafted as a wide receiver, that tells you what people thought of you coming out. And to work your way up to a starting wide receiver in the National Football League, KJ Osborn is the epitome of a grinder, a hard worker, great teammate, great character guy, all those synonyms that you want to put in there. But at the end of the day, when you have a guy as talented and performing as well as Jordan Addison, you have to make that switch. But it becomes increasingly difficult when you have a guy like KJ Osborn, where it wasn't nearly as difficult when you have a guy like BC Johnson. And I think those elements really come into play that we don't necessarily think about or talk about nearly as much as we probably should, because in the building stuff matters. Camaraderie matters. How your teammates view you matters. We talk about that with quarterback controversies. If the locker room's given up on a guy like, say, Zach Wilson, then the coaches have to take him out and they have to put in another guy because the locker room has turned. And having people believe in you and having people know what you are, who you are, that matters here too. And just based on talent, you have to take out KJ Osborn and yet put in Jordan Addison. He's proven he can handle it.
Miles, is this just Addison trying to force his hand a little bit? What else I think does Addison have to do, or what does the coaching staff have to do, I guess, to give Jordan Addison a little bit more reps than KJ, despite all the great things too and all the good things behind the scenes that KJ Osborn does do?
I mean, it's definitely a consistency thing. I think we see the big plays. The big plays matter, and obviously Addison's showing that he can make those plays. But at the same time, there's a consistency that comes to it too, like a down and a down, routes, every rep matters. And they watch that film, whether Addison's getting targeted or not, they watch the film on if he won his route, how he looked off the route, if he's running the right depth, if he's doing all the things that you're supposed to be doing. Now, I haven't watched enough to say that he is or isn't, but the coaches are obviously doing that. And so those are things that he needs to prove to them, that he knows every route tree. He knows all the entire route tree. He knows the entire playbook. He knows all the routes for each specific position, because he might have to interchange, because they do a lot of interchanging there. Obviously JJ's the guy. They build the offense around JJ for the passing game, but that means the guys that play behind him have to know everything, because they might be asked to play some random position at any given play, because JJ might be swapping with them because they need that play to be featured for JJ. So there's a lot of things that go into it behind the scenes that I think people might not always realize. It's not just know your route and go. You need to know the encompassing factor of that play and why it matters. And so I don't, like I said, I don't have the answer if he's doing all those things correctly or not. He's obviously doing enough to show that the talent's there. And I think that's the huge part of it. And then KJ is struggled enough to not have some drops and some of those things. So I think there's room for Addison to obviously take more of those reps away. It's just about how the team feels Addison taking those reps away. And if there's enough of that, to Forno's point, camaraderie and enough gel with Kirk Cousins and the rest of the offense for that to happen. And now I've kind of said over all offseason, I expected KJ to be the guy, that number 2 receiver, to start the season. But then Addison was slowly just take that role over. And obviously the BC Johnson comparison's similar, but to put that both your guys' points is he's not anywhere near as talented as what KJ Osborn is. So it's not just this easy, we're just going to swap you out in week 2, week 3, because we still have a guy that we can give run to. And KJ is a good player. And I don't want to take away from the stumbles he's had to start the season, because he's still a good player. But I think it's time that Addison kind of gets more of that run so that he can still build up his reps, because the whole thing about Jordan Addison is it's about the long term for him. Yes, you want him to be a competitive contributor now, but you want to build him into this system long term as well.
What do you guys make if Jordan Addison's a stud, and maybe even the 2023 draft class in general? Mekhi Blackman's gotten some run here. This draft class has already made somewhat of a little bit of immediate impacts. I don't know if it's fair to throw Ivan Pace into the draft class since he was a UDFA, and we probably shouldn't. But
is.
You throw him in there? You include him in the draft class
because he's a rookie, and you brought him in as someone that you gave quite a bit of like guaranteed money to.
So one thing I think people don't think about when it comes to like UDFAs, why didn't they draft him? Well, it's very possible everybody on their board that they took, they had higher than Pace, and they could have still had Pace with like a 4th round valuation because they said they had a day 2 grade and a starter grade on Dwayne McBride. They took him in round 7. So that's something that needs to be taken into account too. It's not that they didn't believe in this guy. They had him just lower on their board than the guys that they did believe in.
Yeah. And not to say this is a completely black and white answer here, but if the 2023 draft class, which again is starting to play some dividends already 2 games in, does that make you feel better? Does it give you a little bit more of forgiveness for what the 2022 draft class isn't accomplishing? I mean, I feel like we're all just looking at the 2022 draft class in a vacuum of, man, that might go down as one of the worst draft classes in Vikings history, even though that's only been a season and 2 games. But what if this 2023 draft class actually turns out to be pretty good? Does that change your opinion, Miles, just of how you look at the last 2 drafts? Is it not complete forgiveness what you did in 2022, but if this draft class is good, do you still have trust in Quasi going forward? Because I just feel like there's so much vitriol towards Quasi because of the bad draft class of the first one in 2022.
No, that's a great point. And I think it's not to give him an excuse, but it's clear that 2022 draft class was definitely more of a, we need to fill positions more than we need to like take the best talent. And that's what it felt like from the 2022 class. Whereas 2023, it felt like they were like, we only have a limited amount of picks. Let's take the best players at the best value positions. And they did that. Whereas 2022, they kind of just said, we have these specific needs that we need to focus on, and we're going to kind of take it because that's where the board seems to fall for us. Because I think they were still struggling with where guys fit. Like, obviously, I think a Caleb Evans I'd consider a hit. But they spent 2 picks on him. They spent a 4th and then a future 4th to get him. So, like, those are things that you also need to factor in. But I think if you can at least salvage a couple of those guys from that 2022 class to pair with the 2023 one, I haven't lost like my trust in Quasi, because I still think there's a lot of room for him to continue to move. But at the same time, it gives you a little bit of pause of some areas that obviously still need to be addressed from this team that they haven't even through the draft. So like obviously interior offensive line, they bring back Garrett Bradbury, but they also draft Ed Ingram, like those types of things that you question, but you also want to give GMs the leeway to make up for those mistakes, because all drafts are pretty unpredictable. And so it's such a small sample size in the grand scheme of things. Like we got 15 years of Rick Spielman. So we kind of knew like where that runway was, but Quasi's only had 2 drafts. So it's really hard to just say that like, this is who he is as a GM with 2 draft class. If one's been good and then one's been very poor on paper, or not even on paper anymore, but so it's kind of one of those situations. It's hard to say like I've lost trust. So I don't know what Forno thinks there, but I don't know. I struggle to just like completely pin all the bad on one person and then not say that the good from this new draft doesn't also like factor.
I think what's really interesting is you can see the dichotomy between the 2 classes, how they were approached by who's on staff. And a lot of the people on staff, because what I think not everybody realizes is draft prep starts right after the previous year's draft. You get all your ducks in a row, you get your watch list, you figure out like your own path of glory, which like, hey, I need my Midwest scout at this game, yada, yada, yada. And then you try and map things out. And then you obviously have to adapt because guys start breaking out. Other guys get hurt and don't play. So you don't have to go and watch them. So there's a lot to it. Well, when you come in middle of January, that process is 8 to 9 months deep. And you're talking to scouts that maybe you don't believe that they're good at their job. Maybe you don't have any kind of rapport with them. So the communication, there's a barrier there. And there's a lot of different nuances when you don't actually hire your own staff, which he didn't. He did not hire the people that he was brought in to manage. And that can be a really difficult task for anybody, not just in the world of football. You go in to a really established building and you have a bunch of people who've been there a long time, and now you're their boss and they have to listen to you. The second you want to change one thing, people can go bananas. And those kind of things that you deal with in a normal workplace can translate to football. So Quasi now has the people he wants running things. They have his systems in place. He obviously is the type of person to adapt based on who he's working with, but they now theoretically have this synergy and a great working environment for how they want this process to go. And the fact that you see what this draft class is doing after an entire year of trying to plan and plot it out, I think speaks to how he wants this process to be conducted, who he knows he can trust and believe with some of these things. And that's how you're seeing the dividends here. And it can be really frustrating because, the 2022 class is not looking great. Yes, it is not. But how is that evolution coming along? And so far, the evolution looks pretty good. But again, you got to give everything time. Quasi could be the greatest general manager of all time, or he could be the worst general manager of all time. He's likely somewhere in the middle. I would project he's going to be above average, likely when all is said and done. But we don't know. And you have to give him time. You have to give this group time to figure it out and prove whether they are or they aren't. And 2 games into the second season is not it.
Yeah, we should also focus on the other parts of what a GM's role is too. It's not just the draft. Like the draft's really fun. I think, we love watching prospects. We love talking about the draft, but a GM's role is obviously more than just the draft, because you have to fill out an entire roster, not just 6-7 guys that you drafted. You have to fill out 63, and when you are 60, what's the total number? 68, and when you include practice squad. So there's a lot more to it than just the draft, as well as the GM, how you factor in the cap, all those moving pieces. So it's just such a minute part of a GM's role, but it obviously gets a lot more focus.
And I feel like, there's probably things he learned from last year's draft into this year's draft. And, he didn't trade back as much. And, I think in hindsight's 2020, but he probably would have just stayed put last year and taken Kyle Hamilton. And I know that's what a lot of Vikings fans would have liked to seen. And
or Jordan Davis.
Or Jordan Davis, not reaching for obviously Andrew Booth, who has turned out to be kind of a bust in this. Yeah,
no?
there's
I'm down. I'm down for that.
Ton of different questions I think that he's learned. College football side. So for now, I was able to watch a good amount of Drake Maye and UNC against the Gophers. It's weird. I felt like not turning this into a Gopher football podcast, because it certainly is not. The Gophers kind of shot themselves in the foot numerous times. There was moments in that game that it felt like the Gophers could have actually won it. Maybe they weren't prepared. But obviously the highlight was watching Drake Maye, who even the broadcasters, it's no secret, probably going to be a first-round pick. He lights the Gophers up and has a lot of sustained drives, likes a lot of big-time throws. The great first throw for that first touchdown was impressive. You've seen him before, but what did you like from Drake Maye's game against the Gophers over the weekend on Saturday?
I'll be honest, I watched a little bit of it, but I didn't watch a lot of it, mainly because I wanted to see Western Kentucky against Ohio State and see what Austin Reed could do, because I think everybody knows I'm a big Austin Reed guy. But what I did see of Drake Maye is just what we've seen time and time again. He knows how to stay poised in the pocket. He's not going to do a lot of that Superman stuff that you see Caleb Williams do, but he is more than capable at working outside of structure and being able to deliver the ball down the field, throw on the move, and he can throw it accurately with velocity, and he can throw it to all levels of the field. And having Nate McCullum back was huge. Just imagine how much better this offense would have been if they actually freed Tez Walker, because he was supposed to be the guy in this offense. And I mean, Kobe Pacer and McCullum are both really good players. They're not on the level of what Tez Walker was going to bring to this group. So I love Drake Maye. I still have him as my number one quarterback temporarily, because I need to continue to watch all the film, and then I can make my final determinations here after the season. going into the year, he was number one because I thought he was a much more polished within the pocket passer with the ability to still do all of that stuff. And he showed it. He is that good. But for me, the biggest takeaway was Ethan Kaliakmanis. Slow down. You don't need to whip everything. Like, he had so much at his fingertips, but he rushed it. He threw bullets when he didn't have to. It's like that kid who gets to go in and pitch in Little League, and all he wants to do is throw fastballs. He wants to throw darts. Well, sometimes you throw a changeup. It can actually be more effective than a fastball. And that's what Ethan's got to learn. He's still young. It's his first full year as a starter. He'll get there. But yeah, Drake Maye's the real deal. And I'm glad Gopher fans got to see it, because I know there's a big contingent of crossover. You're going to hear us talk a lot about Drake Maye, and a lot of it's going to be real good.
We talk about the Vikings having quarterback problems. Gophers have their own podcast sphere I feel like they could get into with quarterback issues over our lifetimes as well. Miles, did anything stand out from Drake Maye's game that you were able to catch on Saturday, or anyone else in the college football scene that you saw over the weekend that impressed you?
Well, yeah, I definitely think with Drake Maye, he's one of those guys, when you compare him and Caleb Williams, I think coaching for Drake Maye might matter less in the sense. I think coaching matters for everybody and every quarterback, but I think he can work within more systems than I think Caleb Williams, or you're going to have to truly build that system around Williams. Whereas I think you could plug Maye into some of these systems and he'd find his way around to rise above whatever system that is. And that's not to say that Caleb Williams can't do some of those things, but I do think there's a little bit more of that true structure that Maye comes with, that with Williams, you want to kind of build that car with him. Whereas a coach could probably take the car and say, hey, Drake, we're going to plug you into it and you're going to start driving, and those types of things. So that's kind of how I view the two of them, but they're both so good. And I think any team's going to be really excited to draft either one, but you're getting a little bit of a different type of player, but both with really high upside. So I really I thought Maye was as advertised on Saturday. I actually kind of expected the game to be a little more out of hand than it was. I think the Gophers, like you said, had a chance. They kind of
that Gopher defense is real good, especially on the back.
It is really good, and I think that's the only that's the biggest positive the Gophers really have for him this year, because that offense, they don't know where they go with their run game. I think the receivers are kind of a little bit all over the place, and you talked about the quarterback; he's just young and developing. So we'll see if he can as they progress. But this season's only going to get harder. The schedule's only going to get harder for them. But as a team, I mean, I thought it was not turning into a Gophers podcast, but I think it was fun to see the Gophers play against an out of conference high level quarterback like Drake Maye, because you don't always get that. So I thought that was a lot of fun.
And I know there's probably Vikings fans with PTSD with drafting a safety, but we'll probably talk about some Tyler Nubin even as well later on in future episodes, because he could be a first-round pick as well. Forno, any other final college football observations before we wrap here in Purple Daily on Draft? What was on the quad box in the Forno basement basically this weekend?
Didn't have a lot of quad box time this weekend. I went to an apple orchard for the first time in my life.
There you go.
I know. I am.
No, not my scene.
Yeah, it's not my scene either. Wife loves it. It wasn't too bad. But one of my big takeaways was we need to stop talking about Joe Milton. He stinks. The only thing he can do is be really big and throw really far. That's it. He can't throw short. He can't throw intermediate. He is not throwing with accuracy, ball placement. And fun fact, he has never thrown a collegiate touchdown on the move. They've all come from a standstill in the pocket. That's a problem too. I think the Joe Milton conversation is 100% done as him being a pro prospect. And I don't think he makes it a few more games until they put in 5-star true freshman Nico Iamaleava. I think I said that right.
Is it that bad? I haven't watched enough of Joe Milton. I obviously from afar this year, but has it been that bad to start the year?
I don't know if you guys know this, but I'm a big Florida Gator fan, and they whipped the crap out of Rocky Top on Saturday night. Yeah. It's been pretty bad. A really rough start against Virginia, and Virginia's got all kinds of issues. I mean, they were dealing with 3 of their players being shot and killed on a bus last year, and major coaching overhaul. And they should have come out there. And if this was the 2022 Tennessee Volunteers, they would have put up 70. They only put up like 49. And while it sounds absurd, it's not. It's college football. This is the norm. And watching this Tennessee team, they're just not there. And Milton's bad. And against Austin P State, a FCS team, he started out 1 of 8, and they were tied at 6 with like 30 seconds left in the first half before they finally got a rushing touchdown. Like, wow. It's bad. This Tennessee team is not anywhere near as good as it was last year, and Joe Milton is really bad.
There you go. There's 4-0's weekly Joe Milton update on Purple Daily on Draft. We might be getting.
I'm done with Joe Milton. I'm done.
I love it.
I didn't think you're in to start though.
Yeah, no, I love the passion with it.
I would for sure give him an opportunity to prove me wrong.
That's fair.
He lost the starting job at Michigan in 2020 and Tennessee in 2021. Yeah. I'm like, why is it going to be any different? Okay, you've had a couple years in the system. Let's see. Show me that you've improved. He hasn't.
Yeah.
Purple Daily on Draft every Monday right here on the Purple Daily YouTube channel. Be back next week as well. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the like button on this video too. Give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Help spread the word. And tell your friends about Purple Daily on Purple Daily on Draft specifically too. Yeah, hit that subscribe button. Daily Minnesota Vikings Entertainment. We'll see you next time.